The way I'm defining the natural high is feeling at my best on a functional level, not happiness or emotional well-being, but just feeling physically and cognitively sharp, having consistently good energy levels, waking up feeling fresh every day, feeling like I can think clearly and focus well and be creative and just operate well physically and mentally. And I've previously summarised some of the things that I think get us closer to this state of operational optimum. But today I want to talk about the barriers to it, what stops us from getting there, what hinders rather than helps. Because sometimes from a philosophical point of view, I do wonder how much of life is just about getting out of your own way. How close to your best self is your default self when you have nothing holding you back? I want to talk about 4 modern day maladies, some of which I have personal experience with. Overconsumption of caffeine, overworking, overstimulation, and stress. Of course, they're not really separate things. Working too much will promote overconsumption of caffeine, which can have a whole host of effects that will ultimately increase your stress levels. Many people are stressed because they're overworked, and some overwork to try and cope with stress. Actually, working too much is a vicious cycle within itself, which I'll elaborate on later. Overstimulation and overworking exacerbate each other because you train yourself never to be able to switch off, which means you never get a chance to properly de-stress. I'm probably missing some relationships, but you get the idea. And the end result of it all is a person who just does not function at their best. Just to be completely clear, I am not saying we shouldn't consume any. Trust me, nobody loves an espresso like Joey D loves an espresso. I just think that a lot of people are overusing caffeine without knowing it. I'm going to explain my situation and maybe it will sound familiar to a few of you. I started drinking coffee when I was about 23, and over the years my intake gradually increased to the point where I was frequently exceeding 700 milligrams of caffeine per day through coffee, energy drinks and pre-workout. Of course, my tolerance increased, so I didn't really feel the usual benefits that you would associate with caffeine. I did feel a lot of other stuff though. My concentration was terrible. I would feel very inconsistent energy levels, completely uncorrelated with when I consumed caffeine, and I didn't sleep well, which of course had an effect on a lot of other things. Interestingly, it was staying asleep rather than getting to sleep that was the issue for me. Eventually, I had a couple of pretty weird episodes, which I think were kind of pseudo panic attacks, and I say pseudo because panic attacks are usually associated with some form of stress or anxiety, which I was not really experiencing whatsoever. Instead, I just had a kind of physical simulation of a panic attack caused by the ridiculous caffeine levels. Now, I hope that never happens to you because it's quite an unsettling experience to say the least, but for me, it was a blessing in disguise. I initially quit caffeine altogether, which I would not recommend, by the way, solely because I was scared of having one of these episodes again. After a couple of weeks of unpleasantness, I began to feel great. My energy levels improved, my concentration was so much better, even my mood, definitely my sleep, literally everything got better. It's really impossible for me to overstate how much my everyday life improved, and it's hard for me to even talk about this without sounding overly dramatic. Nowadays, I limit myself to about 150 milligrams of caffeine, or the equivalent of a double espresso, and I have that before 9 a.m. That has been my limit for the last 2.5 years, and it always will be because I know where it leads when I gradually allow myself more. This of course is just my personal experience, and I don't want to demonize caffeine altogether. People do have different sensitivities to caffeine, and so your optimal intake or optimal dosage where you can get most of the benefits with few or no drawbacks is likely very different than mine. But I think there is a broader point to make about many aspects of life. There is often a Goldilocks zone, and more is not always better, and in this case I would rather have some than none, but I would rather have none than too much. I could of course spend a few minutes ripping into hustle culture and making fun of stupid quotes like "whilst you sleep I work," which I've never understood. I mean, isn't sleeping better than work? But you're not going to get anything original, and at best it's going to be like 5 out of 10 funny. Most of all though, it is beside the point. So here is the point. Being overworked makes you function worse, which makes the work that you do a bit shit. You've probably heard of the studies and experiments on a 4-day work week, often showing that the increase in productivity isn't just a higher relative productivity per hour, but that it's high enough to make 4 days actually more productive than 5. Now, ultimate productivity is not my main concern, but I expect that underpinning these improvements in productivity are improvements in cognitive function that arise from not being overworked. A busy mind certainly seems to be a less creative mind. In fact, all levels of cognitive performance, including short-term memory, abstract thinking, and problem solving, seem to be negatively impacted by longer working hours. I don't know about you, but I like the sound of abstract thinking. Sounds good and abstract. Just as a brief tangent, we are working fewer and fewer hours as the years go by, but the type of work we do seems to be more mentally draining. 100 years ago, most jobs were pretty much based around manual labor, whereas today, you have to demonstrate
applying strategic solutions in a dynamic and fast-paced environment.
And loads of other stupid shit that you see on job application forms. It's fairly evident at this point that you can only work hard and smart up to a point before working harder makes you patently less smart. And this is a cycle that I've found myself in before, probably working a bit too much and then seeing the work that I do suffer and then trying to compensate for bad work with more work, and so you enter the cycle. Another thing I've felt is how mental fatigue can cross over into physical performance. If I've been sat at my computer for too long and then I go and train, my workout always suffers. So what can you do about it? Well, I don't really know. I just decided to work less. I decided it was going to take me a little bit longer to hit 1 million subscribers. Decided to say no to a few brand deals because I didn't want to work to a schedule. I decided just to go for more walks and post less on Instagram and YouTube. And I think a big part of why I still enjoy making YouTube videos is because I never really let my perception of the YouTube algorithm dictate my upload schedule and therefore my working schedule. Now, I also understand that I am in a very lucky position to be able to make these decisions, and for most people, maybe for you, it may not be that simple. It might take months or even years of planning to eventually get to a point where you are working a manageable amount. But I mean, unless you're planning to die pretty soon, then you do have months and years, and so you might as well make some kind of plan, because I think it's worth it. By this, I mean never being able to switch off, associating doing nothing with being bored, and really just not having the ability to sit still, metaphorically and literally. For the most part, this manifests itself in pointless scrolling, or task switching as it's known, because anytime there's no stimulation, you automatically reach for the phone. Now, I'm sure we don't need another video of a YouTuber saying social media is bad.
9/11 was bad.
Just like coffee, it's not use but overuse that's the problem. Lots of studies link poor mental health to overuse of social media, and I think it's safe to say that poor mental health probably decreases your ability to function well and feel good. But I was wondering, does endless scrolling hinder your ability to concentrate directly? Since your brain will adapt to anything you do regularly, the theory goes that if you are constantly spending short amounts of time focusing on something before jumping to something else, then you'll begin to do that habitually. So when it comes to focusing on something important rather than just a TikTok video, you will actively look for distraction. This makes sense to me and intuitively feels quite true to my own experience, but I couldn't find any evidence of an actual long-term effect. There is a common claim that you'll find on the first page of Google saying that we've all developed a shorter attention span than a goldfish, but I tried to dig into the sources for that claim and I came to the conclusion that somebody had actually just made it up one day, probably for an article title, which does happen more often than you'd expect. So without firm data, I can only really go by my own experience, and all I can say generally is that when I spend too much time on social media or even just flicking between lots of different apps trying to find something to entertain myself, I come out of it feeling very mentally scattered and as if I am unable to hold down a train of thought. And I suppose that is reason enough for me to want to do it less. Of course, stress is largely a result of all of the above, plus loads of other stuff, some of which you can and much of which you cannot control. And stress isn't always a bad thing. In some situations, simply reframing stress as excitement leads to better performance than trying to reduce the amount of stress felt. One study simply told students that stress improves performance right before they took exams, and they outperformed those who weren't told anything. That being said, most of the time it is a bad thing. Apart from being a risk factor for loads of stuff that will literally kill you, stress can increase cortisol levels, which can have a blunting effect on your testosterone. It can negatively impact athletic performance and recovery, and very high cortisol can start to affect executive functions like reasoning, planning, and organization. Chronic stress can also impact perceived energy levels, which we care about a lot. The difference between good and bad stress seems to be quite individual, both in terms of how a person views stress and in terms of their hormonal response to it. It's also largely down to the amount of stress experienced, where very high stress is rarely going to be a good thing, regardless of how you view it or respond to it physiologically. I think on an individual level we have a pretty good idea of what helps and hinders us, and therefore if we are operating at a level of stress that is going to affect our everyday physical and cognitive function. My approach to stress and anxiety control is pretty much the same as my approach to anything. Be entirely pragmatic about whatever you possibly can, and then try not to worry about that which is outside of your control. And a big part of that pragmatic approach is first making sure that I'm not overworked, overstimulated, or over caffeined? Is that a word? You can make things up if you want. And beyond that, what are the main causes of stress? It's money or health. So I live within my means and I eat fruit and veg. That's obviously massively oversimplified, but if you're doing all of that, then you're at least taking care of most of the negative stress that you can control. Now, I haven't got all these things figured out. For me, overstimulation is probably the one I'm worst at. And of course, these are just a few things that I think are fairly common to my generation. I suppose that I wanted to make this video because I think, and this is just an opinion, some of the biggest differences in everyday quality of life that a person can gain come from doing less rather than more. And I think that's important because it's true that not everyone has the time, money, or motivation to add things into their routine. When people think about improving their quality of life, they often go to running or meditating or starting a journal or overhauling their diet. That's all fine, but why not start with the things that give you the best return for the least effort? Said like a true hard worker there. Nobody can't afford one less cup of coffee or to smoke or drink less. Yeah, nobody hasn't got the time to work or scroll on Instagram less. It might be other things that you know you can cut out, so by all means let me know what you plan to do less of or what you think your obstacles are, because sometimes, I think fairly often, less is more. Right? Obviously apart from likes and subscribers, so if you could do that for us. Is it there or there? I can never remember. Do that. Bye.
Joey Lenny is my hero.